Hey guys, tonight we begin with something darker than usual. Picture this: wooden hulks rotting in British harbours, their timbers groaning with every tide, packed bow to stern with men the Empire would rather forget. Thieves, forgers, deserters, debtors, and among them, hidden in the shadows below deck, men convicted of what the Victorians called the worst crime imaginable. Forget the pristine tall ships and maritime romance Hollywood sold you. The floating prisons of Victorian Britain were hell on water, and for gay men trapped inside them, they were something even worse. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. But seriously, have you ever wondered what it was like to be sentenced to a ship that never sailed? To live for years in a wooden cage, moored permanently in a river, surrounded by water, but trapped tighter than any land prison? Have you ever thought about how Victorian society dealt with gay men who got caught? Not just the gentlemen in parlours, but the working class men who had no lawyers, no connections, no escape. What did it smell like down there, really? How many men to a hammock when there were not enough hammocks? What happened when the tide came in and the bilge water rose? Did anyone on shore even think about them? And what is the Victorian equivalent of being ghosted? Because, spoiler alert, it involves literal ghosts and a lot of rats. Congratulations, you have been sentenced to transportation for gross indecency. The year is 1867. You are standing in chains on a dock in Portsmouth Harbour, staring up at a ship that will never move again. Let us see if you can survive. Good luck. The hulks were not supposed to be permanent. That is the first thing to understand. They started as a stopgap measure in 1776, when Britain lost the American colonies and suddenly had nowhere to send convicts anymore. Australia was not taking full shipments yet. The prisons on land were overflowing. So the government looked at the old warships rotting in their dockyards, ships too damaged or outdated to fight, and had a thought that seemed practical at the time. Why not just leave prisoners on them? Temporarily, of course. Just until we figure out transportation to Australia. Just until the system catches up. The hulks lasted 80 years. By the time the Victorian era arrived in full force, the floating prisons had become a permanent fixture of British criminal justice. Ships with names like Defence, Warrior, Fortitude, and Discovery sat anchored in the Thames, the Medway, and Portsmouth Harbour. From the shore, they looked almost picturesque in the fog. Up close, they were rotting nightmares held together by tar, iron, and desperation. Each hulk held between 300 and 500 men. Some held more. The Justitia, moored off Woolwich, once held over 700 souls in a space designed for a crew of 200. The ships themselves were stripped of masts, sails, rigging, anything that might allow them to move. What remained was a floating wooden box with gun ports for windows and decks divided into dormitories by rough wooden partitions. The men inside were called convicts, prisoners, transportees waiting for the next ship to Australia. But a significant number were simply called lost. And among the lost were men convicted under laws that barely spoke their crime aloud. The Buggery Act of 1533 was still on the books. It had been for over 300 years. Under Henry VIII, it was a capital offence, death by hanging. By the Victorian period, the punishment had softened slightly, though softened is a generous word. A man convicted of sodomy could still be hanged, but more often he was sentenced to transportation for life, or a term of years that might as well have been life, or hard labour in a place the courts preferred to forget. The hulks were that place. These men did not arrive with signs around their necks. The charge was written in the ledger as unnatural offence or gross indecency, or sometimes just a blank line with a clerk's notation too obscene to record in official books. Their names were entered, their sentences recorded, and then they were rowed out to the hulks in the grey morning fog and swallowed whole. Let me tell you about Thomas White. He was 23 years old in 1862 when he was sentenced to 10 years penal servitude for sodomy. The trial took less than a day. He had been caught with another man, a sailor named James Dobson, in a boarding house near the London docks. The landlady testified, a constable testified. Thomas and James said nothing in their own defence because there was nothing to say that would not make it worse. Thomas was sent to the defence hulk at Woolwich. James was sent to the Warrior at Portsmouth. They never saw each other again. The defence was over 90 years old by the time Thomas arrived. She had been a third-rate ship of the line, 64 guns, launched in 1763 to fight the French. By 1862, she was a gutted carcass with peeling paint and a permanent list to starboard. You could smell her from the shore when the wind was right. Rotting wood, human waste, damp wool, unwashed bodies, bilge water that had not been pumped in weeks. Thomas was brought aboard in irons, chains at the wrists and ankles. He climbed a rope ladder up the side. The stairs had rotted away years ago and was shoved through a hatch into the lower deck. It was darker than he expected. The gun ports let in slashes of grey light, but not enough to see clearly. The ceiling was so low he had to hunch. The air was thick, warm in summer, cold in winter, always damp. There were men everywhere, sitting on the floor, hanging in hammocks strung so close together they touched, leaning against the bulkheads, standing in clusters near the hatchways where the air was slightly better. 300 men in a space meant for 150. A guard walked Thomas to the stern section and pointed at an empty stretch of floor. There, you sleep there. No hammock, no blanket, just floor. Thomas asked when he would get a hammock. The guard laughed. When someone dies. He was not joking. The hammocks were rationed. There were not enough. Men doubled up or took shifts. One man slept, while another worked the day shift on shore. Thomas spent his first 3 nights on the floor between 2 other men who did not speak to him. One of them coughed all night. The other snored and kicked in his sleep. On the 4th night, a man 2 rows over died. Heart gave out. He was 60 years old and had been on the hulk for 9 years, waiting for transportation that never came. Thomas got his hammock. The daily routine on the hulks was designed to break you slowly. Wake at 5 in the morning when the bell rang. Assemble on deck for count. Eat breakfast if there was any, usually a piece of bread and a tin cup of something that might have been coffee once. Then the work gangs. Most of the prisoners were sent ashore every day to work. Hard labour, dredging the river, hauling stone, building docks, digging foundations for the expanding dockyards and arsenals that fed the Royal Navy's endless appetite for expansion. It was back-breaking work in all weather, supervised by guards with truncheons and little patience. But not everyone went ashore. Men convicted of certain crimes were kept on the ship. High escape risks, violent offenders, and men whose crimes were considered too morally repugnant to work alongside regular convicts. Guess which category sodomy fell into? Thomas stayed on the hulk. So did a dozen other men with the same unspoken charge. They were assigned to shipboard work instead, scrubbing the decks, pumping the bilges, hauling waste buckets up from below and dumping them over the side, mending the hammocks and sails that were no longer used. Pointless work designed to fill the hours and keep them visible. The other prisoners knew what they were. Word spread fast in a confined space. Some of the men were hostile, others indifferent. A few were quietly sympathetic in ways that suggested they understood more than they let on. But silence was survival. You did not talk about why you were there. You did not explain. You worked. You ate. You found a corner to sleep in. You kept your head down. And if you were lucky, you went unnoticed. Thomas was not lucky. There was a man on the defence named Edward Gill. He was a guard, 37 years old, former sailor, built like a brick wall and just as warm. He had worked the hulks for 6 years and he knew every trick, every hiding place, every whispered conversation below deck. He also knew which prisoners had been convicted of sodomy, and he knew what that meant they were willing to do. The Victorian prison system ran on a very simple piece of cruelty. No one cared what happened to you, as long as you did not die loudly. The hulks were overseen by a skeleton crew of guards and a superintendent who visited once a month to review the logs. Discipline was maintained through violence, isolation, and hunger. Official punishments included flogging, solitary confinement in the ship's old powder magazine, and reduction of rations. Unofficial punishments were worse. Edward Gill started with small demands. Extra work. Scrub this section again. Polish that brass fitting, even though there was no brass left to polish. Thomas obeyed. What choice did he have? Then the demands changed. Gill started appearing below deck after lights out. He would walk slowly through the rows of hammocks, boots loud on the wooden floor, and stop beside certain men. He never said much, just a hand on a shoulder, a quiet word, an order to follow him. Thomas was ordered to follow him on his 9th week aboard. They went to a storage room near the stern. It was tiny, dark. It smelled like tar and mildew. There was a crate to sit on and nothing else. Gill closed the door. What happened in that room happened to Thomas 11 more times over the next 4 months. He was not the only one. There were at least 3 other men Gill visited regularly. None of them spoke about it. What was there to say? They had been convicted for loving men. Now they were being used by one. The irony was not lost on Thomas. It just did not matter. He thought about James sometimes, wondered if he was still alive, if he was being treated the same way, if he thought about Thomas at all, or if he had buried the memory along with everything else that hurt too much to carry. There were no letters. Prisoners on the hulks were allowed to send and receive mail, technically, but letters were read by the guards before delivery. Anything inappropriate was destroyed. Thomas had tried to write to his mother once. The letter was returned to him with certain sentences crossed out in heavy black ink. He never tried again. James had no family that Thomas knew of. No one to write to. No one who would write back. The months blurred together. Summer turned to autumn. The river smelled worse in the heat. Cholera went through the ship in August. 15 men died in 2 weeks. The bodies were rowed ashore at night and buried in the prison cemetery at Woolwich without markers. Thomas survived. He did not know if that was luck or punishment. In October, a new prisoner arrived. His name was Arthur Finch, 28 years old, dark hair, thin build, sentenced to 7 years for gross indecency with another man in a public house in Southwark. The trial records noted that he had shown no remorse. Arthur was assigned a hammock 3 rows from Thomas. They did not speak for the first 2 weeks. You did not make friends quickly on the hulks. Trust was dangerous. But Arthur had a way of watching people that was different from the other men. Not hostile, not predatory, just aware. One evening during the dinner ration, thin soup and bread so hard you had to soak it first, Arthur sat down on the floor next to Thomas without asking. He broke his bread in half and offered a piece. Thomas stared at it. "Why?" Arthur shrugged. "You look like you could use it." Thomas took the bread. They ate in silence. Around them, 300 men did the same, the sound of chewing and coughing and the creak of the ship settling into the mud at low tide. After a while, Arthur spoke quietly. "How long have you been here?" 4 months. "How much longer?" 10 years. Arthur nodded slowly. He did not say he was sorry. There was no point. "I was told they transport people to Australia." "They do," Thomas said. "Sometimes, if there is room on a ship, if you are not too old or too sick, if your crime is not—" He stopped. "Not what we did," Arthur finished. Thomas looked at him. Really looked. Arthur's eyes were very steady. He was not being cruel, just honest. "They do not send us," Thomas said quietly. "We stay here. Forever? Until we die, or the sentence ends." Arthur absorbed this. Then he smiled, very faint, very bitter. Well, at least the company is familiar. Thomas almost laughed. He did not, because laughter drew attention, but the urge was there. They became something like friends after that. Not openly. You could not be openly anything on the hulks. But they sat near each other at meals. They worked the same shifts when they could. They spoke in low voices during the few hours of free time in the evenings when the guards were drunk or absent. Arthur had been a clerk before his arrest. He could read and write better than most of the men on the ship. He had family in London, a sister who had disowned him, and a mother who pretended he had died. Thomas had been a docker. He could not read. His family was in Kent. His father was dead. His mother had not come to the trial. "Do you think about him?" Arthur asked one night. They were sitting near the stern gun port, watching the lights of Woolwich flicker across the black water. "The man they caught you with." Thomas did not answer right away. Then, "Every day." Arthur nodded. "Me too." They did not say the names aloud. It felt safer that way, as if speaking the names might make the ghosts more real. But the ghosts were already there. The hulks were full of them. Life on a prison hulk was not one long continuous nightmare. That would almost be easier to endure. Instead, it was 100 small suffocations stretched over years. Boredom and fear in equal measure. Long hours of nothing interrupted by sudden violence or illness, or the arbitrary cruelty of men with power over men without it. The food was the same every day. Bread, soup, occasionally a piece of salt pork so tough it could sole a boot. The water was rationed and tasted like rust. Scurvy was common, dysentery more so. Medical care was a joke. There was a surgeon assigned to the hulks who visited twice a week if the weather was good. He carried a bag of very old instruments and a deeply unshakable faith in bloodletting. If you were sick enough to see him, you were probably dying. If you were dying, he bled you and made it faster. Thomas watched a man lose 3 fingers to infection because the surgeon insisted the wound just needed air. The fingers were buried at sea. The man survived, barely. There were no priests. Technically, the prisoners were allowed religious services on Sunday, but the chaplain assigned to the defence had stopped coming 2 years earlier after a prisoner spat in his face. No replacement was sent. Some of the older prisoners led their own services. They sang hymns from memory in the evening, voices rough and out of tune, but earnest. Thomas did not join them. He had stopped praying around the same time he realised God was not listening. Arthur went once. He came back and said it felt like singing to the walls. The only regular visitor to the hulk was a man named Charles Pearson. He was a prison inspector, appointed by the Home Office to ensure the hulks met minimum standards of humanity. He arrived every 3rd month with a ledger and a handkerchief pressed to his nose. He would walk the decks for exactly 30 minutes. He would ask the superintendent if there had been any deaths. He would glance at the ration stores. He would note the number of men currently in solitary confinement. Then he would leave. His reports always concluded the same way. Conditions adequate given the temporary nature of the facility. Temporary, after 80 years. The prisoners called him the Handkerchief Man. He never learned their names. Winter came hard in 1862. The Thames froze in places. The gun ports had to be sealed against the wind, which made the lower deck even darker and closer than usual. Men huddled together for warmth. The hammocks swung with every gust that hit the hull. Thomas got sick in January. It started as a cough, then a fever. Then he could not get warm no matter how many layers he wore or how close he pressed to the other bodies in the dark. Arthur brought him extra rations, stole them, more likely, though he never said how. Bread wrapped in a rag, a tin cup of something hot that might have been tea. "You need to eat," Arthur said, crouching beside Thomas's hammock. Thomas could barely sit up. "Not hungry." "Eat anyway." Thomas tried. The bread sat in his stomach like a stone. He gave the rest to Arthur, who pocketed it without argument. The fever broke after 5 days. Thomas woke up drenched in sweat, shivering, alive. Arthur was asleep on the floor beside his hammock, using his own coat as a pillow. Thomas reached down and shook his shoulder gently. Arthur woke instantly, the way men did in prison, alert, guarded. "You stayed," Thomas said. "You were dying." "I was not." "You looked like you were." Arthur sat up, rubbing his face. "Scared the hell out of me." They looked at each other in the dim pre-dawn light. Around them, the ship creaked and settled. 300 men breathing in unison, a sound like the ocean itself. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly. Arthur just nodded. He did not say "you are welcome." He did not say it was nothing. He just nodded and stood up and went to his own hammock before the morning bell rang. That was the day Thomas realized he was in love with him. He did not want to be. It was the worst possible thing he could feel in the worst possible place. But there it was, undeniable as the cold, solid as the iron chains they still wore when they worked. He was in love with Arthur Finch, a man he had known for 3 months, a man who had stolen bread for him and slept on the floor beside him and looked at him like he mattered. Thomas told himself it would pass. Feelings always passed if you ignored them long enough. He had loved James and buried it. He could do the same now. But James had been taken from him by force, by trial and sentence and separation. Arthur was right here. The thing about the hulks that no one on shore understood was how much of life happened in silence. You learned to communicate without words, a glance, a nod, the angle of someone's shoulders when they were afraid or angry or too tired to care anymore. Thomas and Arthur developed a language of small gestures, sitting near each other at meals, passing a cup of water without being asked, the brief touch of a hand on a shoulder in passing, too quick for the guards to notice, but there. It was not much. It was everything. In February, a new regulation was posted. All prisoners convicted under the Labouchere Amendment or related morality statutes were to be separated from the general population during work details and meals. The Labouchere Amendment was new. Passed in 1885, though on the defence time, moved strangely and news arrived late. It criminalised gross indecency between men even in private. Before, you had to be caught in the act of sodomy. Now, simply being alone together in a suspicious context was enough. The law had not existed when Thomas was convicted. But it existed now, and the prison system applied it retroactively with enthusiasm. Arthur and 12 other men were moved to a separate section of the lower deck, a space near the bow that was smaller, darker, colder. They were forbidden from eating with the general population. Their work shifts were isolated. They were counted separately. The other prisoners called it the stern section, though it was nowhere near the stern. The guards called it the reprobate ward. The men inside called it nothing because naming it gave it power. Thomas was not moved with them. His conviction predated the new policy by a matter of months. Some clerk reviewing the records had decided his crime was old enough to be general population. It was arbitrary, meaningless. It separated him from Arthur anyway. They could still see each other across the deck during count. They could pass in the narrow walkways between shifts. But they could not speak openly, could not sit together, could not exist in proximity without a guard watching. Arthur handled it with the same quiet endurance he handled everything. He did not complain, did not rage. He just adapted. Thomas was less steady. He felt the absence like a physical wound. It was worse than the separation from James, because Arthur was still visible, still breathing the same foul air, still close enough to touch but untouchable. He started taking risks. Small ones at first, passing Arthur in the corridor and letting their hands brush, lingering too long near the reprobate ward during free time, whispering a few words when the guards were distracted. Then bigger risks. There was a storage space below the waterline where the old anchor cables were kept. It was damp and smelled like rot, but it was private. The guards rarely checked it because there was nothing to steal and nowhere to escape to. Thomas started going there during the evening shift change when the corridors were chaos and no one tracked who went where. The third time he went, Arthur was waiting. They did not speak. There was nothing safe to say. Arthur just reached out and took Thomas's hand in the dark and held it. They stood like that for maybe 2 minutes, hand in hand, breathing in sync, the hull creaking around them and the river slapping against the planks. Then footsteps above. They let go and slipped out separately, 30 seconds apart. It became routine. Once a week, sometimes twice if they could manage it. Never the same day, never predictable. Just stolen minutes in the dark where they could be 2 men instead of 2 convicts. Sometimes they talked, whispered conversations about nothing important. Arthur's sister, who had written him 1 letter and then stopped. Thomas's mother, who had not. The weather, the food, the guards. Sometimes they did not talk at all, just stood close enough to feel the heat of another body. Once, Arthur kissed him, quick and desperate and too rough. Thomas kissed him back. They broke apart, breathing hard, and did not speak of it after. But it happened again the next time, and the time after that. They were careful. They were so careful. And then Edward Gill found out. It was not dramatic. No one caught them in the act. Gill simply noticed the pattern. Thomas disappearing at certain times. Arthur disappearing at the same times. Both of them returning separately with the same look on their faces. Gill was not a clever man, but he was observant, and he knew what men like Thomas wanted because he had been taking it from them for years. He waited until Thomas was alone on deck one morning, scrubbing the planks near the bow. "You have been busy," Gill said quietly, standing too close. Thomas kept scrubbing. "Just working." "Not what I meant." Gill crouched down, his face level with Thomas's. "You and the pretty one from the reprobate ward. You think I do not notice?" Thomas's hands went still. He did not look up. "Here is how this works," Gill continued, voice low and casual. "You can keep seeing him. I do not care. But it costs. I have nothing. You have time. You have privacy. You have my silence." Gill smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "And I have needs." Thomas understood. Of course he understood. This was the trade. The only currency on the hulks was suffering, and Gill was offering to redistribute it. "Once a week," Gill said. "The storage room by the stern. You come when I call. You do what I say. And your friend stays safe. No reports. No isolation. No additional charges." Thomas wanted to refuse, wanted to fight, wanted to drive the scrub brush through Gill's teeth. But Arthur was 3 charges away from a flogging. All prisoners were. The guards kept tallies. 3 infractions, and you were stripped and tied to the mast and whipped until you bled. Thomas had seen it happen to a man who stole an extra bread ration. He could not let it happen to Arthur. "Fine," Thomas said. Gill stood up, satisfied. "Good lad. Tonight, after the count." He walked away whistling. Thomas went back to scrubbing. His hands were shaking. He scrubbed until his knuckles bled, and the deck was cleaner than it had been in months. That night he went to the storage room by the stern. Jill was waiting. What happened there happened every week for the next 4 months. Thomas stopped counting the times. Counting made it real in a way he could not survive. He did not tell Arthur. What would be the point? Arthur would try to stop it and get himself hurt. Or worse, Arthur would blame himself. Thomas could not carry that on top of everything else. So he carried it alone. He got good at disappearing inside his own head during those sessions. At thinking about other things. The sound of rain on the river. The way the light looked through the gun ports at dawn. James's laugh, half remembered. Arthur's hand in his. Gill did not care if Thomas was present or not. He just wanted a body that would not fight back. Afterward, Thomas would go to the anchor cable room and wait to see if Arthur came. Sometimes he did. Sometimes he did not. When he did, Thomas held him a little tighter, kissed him a little longer, tried to remember what it felt like to want this instead of endure it. Arthur noticed something was wrong. He was not stupid. "You have been different," Arthur said one night in the dark. "I am fine." "You are lying." Thomas said nothing. Silence was safer than lies. Arthur reached up and touched his face, just a gentle hand against his cheek. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." "I can't. Thomas, I can't." His voice broke. He pulled away before Arthur could feel him shaking. "I have to go." He left Arthur standing there in the dark and did not go back for 2 weeks. The guilt was worse than the abuse. That was the cruelest part. Gil was doing what he had always done. Thomas was used to that flavour of cruelty. But hurting Arthur by pulling away, that was new. That was a wound Thomas had inflicted himself. He told himself it was protection. That distance kept Arthur safe, but it felt like cowardice. In May, a transport ship arrived. The Neptune, bound for Van Diemen's Land, with room for 200 convicts. The superintendent walked the decks with a list, calling out names. 70 men from the defence were selected: thieves, forgers, a few violent offenders whose sentences were nearly complete. They were rowed ashore, processed, and loaded onto the Neptune within 2 days. Arthur's name was not called. Neither was Thomas's. No one convicted of sodomy or gross indecency was ever selected for transport. The official reason was that such men posed a moral risk to the other convicts during the long voyage. The real reason was that they were not meant to be rehabilitated. They were meant to disappear. After the Neptune sailed, the hulk felt emptier. 70 fewer men meant slightly more space. Hammocks for everyone now. A little less noise at night. It should have been better. It just felt more like a tomb. Thomas started going back to the anchor cable room. He did not know if Arthur would be there. He went anyway, at the usual times, and waited in the dark. The 4th time, Arthur appeared. He did not say anything, just walked over to where Thomas was standing and wrapped both arms around him and held on. Thomas broke. He had not cried since the trial, had not let himself. But now, with Arthur's arms around him and no one to see, he cried. Arthur held him through it, did not ask questions, did not demand explanations, just held him until the shaking stopped. "I am sorry," Thomas said finally, voice wrecked. "I am so sorry." "For what?" "For leaving. For—" He could not finish. Arthur pulled back just enough to look at him. "You do not have to explain. Whatever you are carrying, you do not have to carry it alone." "You do not understand. Then help me understand." So Thomas told him. Not everything, not the details, but enough. About Gil, about the trade, about the choice that was not really a choice. Arthur listened in silence. When Thomas finished, Arthur's jaw was tight and his hands were fists. "I am going to kill him," Arthur said quietly. "No." "Thomas." "No." Thomas grabbed his wrists. "You will be hanged. They hang prisoners who kill guards. I will not let you die for me. I will not let him keep doing this to you. He will stop when my sentence is up. 9 more years. I can survive 9 more years." "You should not have to." "But I do." Thomas let go of his wrists. "We both do. That is the world we live in." Arthur looked at him for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "I love you." The words hung in the air between them. 3 words that were a crime in themselves. 3 words that could add years to a sentence if spoken in front of the wrong person. 3 words that were still true. "I love you too," Thomas said. They kissed, slow and careful and aching. Not the desperate kisses of before, but something gentler, something that tasted like grief and hope in equal measure. When they broke apart, Arthur rested his forehead against Thomas's. "We will survive this, both of us, together." "Together," Thomas echoed. It was a promise neither of them knew if they could keep, but they made it anyway, because what else was there? The hulks ran on a very specific kind of time, not clock time or calendar time, but survival time, measured in rations and beatings, and the gap between one illness and the next. Days blurred into weeks, into months, into years. Thomas marked time by Gill's visits, once a week, every week, 52 weeks a year, 4 years so far, 208 times. He stopped counting after that. Arthur marked time by letters he wrote and never sent. He had a stub of pencil and scraps of paper smuggled from the work crews that went ashore. He wrote to his sister, to his mother, to the man who had been arrested with him, whose name Thomas never learned. He kept the letters hidden in a crack in the hull near his hammock. He never mailed them. There was no point. But writing them gave him something to do with the hours that were not sleep or work or stolen minutes with Thomas. One letter was to Thomas. Arthur showed it to him once, in the dark. It was short, just a few lines. I do not know if we will leave this place alive. But if we do, I want to live somewhere you can see the stars. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere no one knows our names or what we were convicted of. I want to grow old with you. I want boring days and warm beds and no more fear. That is all. That is everything. Thomas read it by touch in the dark, fingers tracing the words he could not see. You should send it, he said. To who? To me. When we get out. Arthur took the letter back, folded it carefully. When we get out, he repeated. Like a prayer, they both knew the odds. Men died on the hulks every month. Disease, malnutrition, violence, age. The Thames was not a forgiving place, and the hulks were not designed for survival. But they pretended anyway, made plans in whispers, imagined futures that probably did not exist. It was the only rebellion left. In 1866, the government announced the hulks would be phased out. The system was inhumane, the reformers said, a stain on British justice. The remaining prisoners would be transferred to land prisons over the next 2 years. The prisoners on the defence did not celebrate. They had heard this before. The hulks had been temporary for 80 years. Promises from Parliament meant nothing. But this time, it was real. Slowly, in batches of 30 or 40, the men were transferred. Millbank Prison, Pentonville, Wandsworth, cold stone cells on solid ground. No more river, no more rot. Just walls and silence and guards who were slightly less drunk. Thomas and Arthur were in the last group to be moved. The defence was nearly empty by then. Fewer than 50 men left. The ship felt enormous and haunted without the press of bodies. On their last night aboard, Thomas and Arthur went to the anchor cable room one final time. They did not speak much, just held each other in the dark and listened to the river. Do you think it will be better? Arthur asked. No, Thomas said honestly, but it will be different. Different is something. Different is something. The next morning, they were rowed ashore in chains. The defence sat empty behind them, listing slightly to starboard, already starting to rot faster without the weight of men to hold her steady. She was broken up for scrap in 1868. No ceremony, no memorial. Just an old ship that had outlived her purpose, cut apart and sold for timber. 300 men had died aboard her. Their names were recorded in ledgers that no one read. Thomas and Arthur were sent to Pentonville. Separate wings, different cell blocks. They saw each other once during exercise, across the yard, too far to speak. Arthur mouthed something. Thomas could not make it out. Then the guards moved them along, and the moment was gone. Pentonville was different from the hulks in every way that mattered, and none of the ways that did not. The cells were cleaner, the food slightly better, the guards more professional. But the silence was worse, each man in a separate cell. No talking allowed except during designated hours. No contact, no touch. Thomas had survived 4 years on a rotting ship surrounded by 300 men. He did not know if he could survive silence. Edward Gill did not work at Pentonville. That was something. Thomas no longer had to see him, no longer had to endure the storage room visits, but the absence did not feel like freedom. It just felt like a different shape of cage. The cells at Pentonville were 7 feet long by 4 feet wide, stone floor, stone walls, a narrow wooden plank for a bed, a bucket in the corner, a small barred window near the ceiling that let in a slash of grey London sky. Thomas had more space to himself than he had ever had on the Hulk. He hated it. On the defence, he had been surrounded by bodies and noise and the constant press of humanity. Here he was, alone with his thoughts and the sound of his own breathing. The silence was so complete it rang in his ears. They were allowed out of the cells for 1 hour of exercise each day. You walked in a circle in the prison yard, hands behind your back, 5 feet from the man in front of you. No talking, no eye contact. Guards watched from towers with rifles. Thomas saw Arthur on the 3rd day. He was 12 men ahead in the circle, walking with his head down. Thomas tried to catch his eye, but Arthur never looked back. Later, Thomas learned why. The separate system, they called it. Pentonville ran on the theory that criminal behaviour was learned from other criminals, so the solution was total isolation. You were not allowed to speak to other prisoners, not allowed to acknowledge them. If you were caught communicating in any way, a glance, a gesture, a whispered word, you lost privileges, food, exercise, daylight. 3 infractions and you went to the dark cells. Solitary confinement in a windowless hole below ground level. Men came out of the dark cells different, quieter, broken in ways that did not heal. So Thomas walked his circle and did not look at Arthur and felt the loneliness like a stone in his chest. The work at Pentonville was different too. No more gangs going ashore to dredge rivers or haul stone. Instead, you worked in your cell. They gave you oakum to pick, old rope that had to be unravelled into fibres for reuse. Your daily quota was £3. If you finished early, you could rest. If you did not finish, you lost dinner. Thomas picked oakum for 8 hours a day. His fingers bled. The fibres got under his nails and into the cracks of his skin. By the end of the first week, his hands looked like they belonged to a much older man. But at least on the Hulk, he'd had Arthur's voice, Arthur's presence, the possibility of touch. Here, he had nothing. The chaplain visited once a week. His name was Reverend Morris. He was young, maybe 30, with soft hands and a voice like honey. He came to each cell individually and asked if you wanted to pray. Most men said yes, not because they believed, but because it was 5 minutes of human conversation in a week of silence. Thomas said no the first 3 times. The 4th time, he was so desperate to hear another voice that he agreed. Reverend Morris knelt beside the plank bed and folded his hands. "What would you like to pray for, Thomas?" Thomas almost laughed. What would he like? Forgiveness, probably. Freedom. Arthur, James. A world where loving men was not a crime punishable by living death. "I do not know," he said instead. "Then let us pray for peace," Morris said gently. They prayed. Thomas did not listen to the words. He just let the sound of Morris's voice wash over him, human and warm and real. When it was over, Morris stood and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. Brief, gentle. It was the first time another person had touched him in 3 months. Thomas almost broke down right there. He held it in until Morris left, then sat on the edge of the plank bed and put his head in his hands and breathed very carefully until the urge to scream passed. That night he dreamed of the Hulk, the smell of it, the press of bodies, Arthur's hand in his in the dark. He woke up hard and aching and ashamed. There was no relief for that here. On the defence, you could at least find a private corner or wait for darkness. Here you were observed constantly. Guards walked the corridors at irregular intervals. The door had a small window they could look through any time. Privacy was another thing the separate system denied you. Thomas lay on his back and stared at the stone ceiling and thought about Arthur and felt like he was losing his mind. 3 months into his time at Pentonville, a new prisoner arrived in the cell next to his. Thomas could hear him through the wall, coughing, pacing, muttering to himself in the dark. The walls were thick but not soundproof. At night, when the prison was quiet, you could hear your neighbours if you pressed your ear to the stone. Thomas started listening, not for anything in particular, just for the reminder that he was not completely alone. The man in the next cell cried sometimes, long, shuddering sobs that went on for hours. Other times he sang, hymns mostly, in a thin, reedy voice that cracked on the high notes. Thomas never learned his name, never saw his face, but he grew familiar with the sounds of him, the rhythms of his grief. One night Thomas hummed along to one of the hymns, quietly, barely audible. The singing stopped. Silence. Then it started again, a little louder. They sang together through the wall. Two men who had never met, harmonizing badly, breaking every rule of the separate system. It became routine. Not every night, just when the silence got too heavy. One of them would start, and the other would join in. The guards never caught them, or if they did not care enough to report it. Small mercies. In the 5th month, Thomas was called to the warden's office. He had no idea why. Prisoners were only summoned for disciplinary hearings or sentence reviews, and Thomas had done nothing. No infractions, no violations. He walked the long corridor between two guards, hands chained, heart pounding. The warden's office was warm. There was a fire in the grate, a wooden desk, shelves of ledgers, a window that looked out over the prison yard. The warden was a man named Sir Edmund Duquesne. He was in his 50s, grey-haired, with the kind of face that suggested he had never smiled in his life. He did not look up when Thomas entered, just gestured to a spot on the floor. "Stand there." Thomas stood. Duquesne flipped through a file on his desk. Thomas White, convicted 1862, sodomy, sentenced to 10 years penal servitude. He looked up. "You have served 6 years, 4 on the hulks, 2 here." Thomas said nothing. "You did not speak unless spoken to." "Your record is clean," Duquesne continued. "No infractions, no violence, adequate work output." He closed the file. "I am transferring you to Public Works." Thomas blinked. Public Works meant leaving Pentonville, going to a different facility. He did not know if that was good or bad. "You will be sent to Portland," Duquesne said. "The quarries. Hard labour. If your conduct remains satisfactory, you may be eligible for early release after 8 years total. 2 more years instead of 4. It was the closest thing to hope Thomas had felt in months. "Do you understand?" Duquesne asked. "Yes, sir." "Good. You leave tomorrow." Thomas was dismissed. He walked back to his cell in a daze. Portland. The quarries. He knew about them. Everyone did. Men broke stone there for the breakwaters and harbour walls. It was brutal work, dangerous. But it was outside. You could see the sky, feel the wind, speak to other men during work hours, and it was 2 years closer to freedom. But it also meant leaving Arthur. That thought hit him like a fist. Arthur was still here at Pentonville, still in the separate system, still isolated and silent and alone. If Thomas left, he would never see him again. He had no way to send a message, no way to say goodbye. The rules forbade it. Even if he tried, Arthur would never receive it. Thomas sat on his plank bed and stared at the wall and felt the weight of it crush him. That night, he pressed his ear to the stone and listened for the man in the next cell, waited for the singing to start. It did not. The man was silent, maybe asleep, maybe transferred, maybe dead. Thomas was alone. He left for Portland the next morning before dawn. He was chained to 15 other prisoners in the back of a transport wagon. The ride took all day. No one spoke. Portland Prison sat on a hill overlooking the sea. It was newer than Pentonville, built specifically to house the convicts who worked the quarries. The cells were similar, small, stone, cold, but the atmosphere was different. Men here were allowed to talk during meals, allowed to work in groups. The silence was not enforced the way it had been at Pentonville. It should have been better. Thomas could not feel the difference. He was assigned to a work gang the second day, 20 men with hammers and chisels, breaking limestone from the quarry face. The stone was loaded into carts and hauled down to the harbour, where it was used to build the massive breakwater that protected Portland's naval base. The work was backbreaking. 12 hours a day in all weather. Your hands blistered and bled and calloused over. Your back ached. Your lungs filled with stone dust. But you could see the ocean. You could feel the spray when the wind came off the water. You could talk to the man working beside you without fear of punishment. Thomas worked next to a man named Samuel. He was 40-something, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, convicted of forgery. He had been at Portland for 3 years. "You get used to it," Samuel said on the first day, swinging his hammer in rhythm. "The work, the cold, the dust. You get used to all of it." Thomas did not think that was true, but he nodded anyway. Samuel was kind in the way men in prison learn to be kind. He showed Thomas how to hold the chisel so it did not slip, how to pace yourself so you did not collapse by midday, where to stand during the count so the wind was at your back. Small mercies again. In the evenings after work, the prisoners were allowed 1 hour in the common room. It was not much, a large stone space with benches and a fireplace that barely worked, but it was something. Men played cards with decks so worn you could barely see the suits. They told stories. They argued about nothing. They existed in proximity to each other like humans instead of numbers. Thomas sat in the corner and watched. He did not join in. He did not know how anymore. One evening, a man sat down beside him without asking. He was young, maybe 25, dark eyes, a scar across his cheek. "You are new," the man said. "Yes." "Where from?" "Pentonville." The man nodded. "That explains it." "Explains what?" "Why you look like a ghost." He held out a hand. "I am Peter." Thomas shook it. "Thomas." "What are you in for, Thomas?" It was a standard question in prison. Everyone asked. Most men lied or deflected. Thomas was too tired to bother. "Sodomy." Peter did not flinch, did not pull his hand back, just nodded slowly. "Me too." Thomas looked at him, really looked. Peter's eyes were steady, not hostile, not pitying, just understanding. "How long?" Thomas asked. 7 years. I have done 4. Peter leaned back against the wall. "You?" 10. I have done 6. Peter let out a low whistle. "And you are still standing. That is something. Barely. Barely counts." Peter smiled. It was a strange expression in this place, almost out of context. "There are others here, men like us. We look out for each other. You are not alone." Thomas wanted to believe him. He just did not know how. But over the next weeks he learned Peter was telling the truth. There were others. Not many, maybe a dozen out of 300 prisoners. But they were there. They did not announce themselves, did not gather openly, but they found each other in small ways. A glance across the quarry, a nod in the common room, shared rations during a meal. They formed a kind of invisible network. If one of them got sick, the others covered his work quota. If one was targeted by guards or other prisoners, the others intervened quietly. It was not safety. Nowhere in prison was safe. But it was solidarity. Thomas had not felt that since the Hulk, since Arthur. He thought about Arthur constantly, wondered if he was still at Pentonville, if he had been transferred, if he had survived. There was no way to find out. Letters between prisoners were forbidden. Even if Thomas could write, which he could not, there was no address to send to. Arthur existed only in memory now. A voice in the dark. A hand in his. A promise whispered in a room that no longer existed. Thomas held on to it anyway. It was all he had. The quarry work had a rhythm to it. Swing, strike, break, load, repeat. Hours blurred into days, days into weeks. In the summer the heat was brutal. The stone reflected the sun until you could barely see. Men collapsed from exhaustion. The guards poured water over them and sent them back to work. In the winter the cold was worse. Your hands went numb. The hammers slipped. Men lost fingers to frostbite or careless blows. Thomas lost a thumbnail in October, smashed it with his own hammer when his grip failed. The nail turned black and fell off 2 weeks later. It grew back crooked. Samuel wrapped it for him with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. "You are getting soft," Samuel said, but his voice was gentle. "I was always soft." "Not anymore." Thomas looked at his hands. They were scarred and calloused and hard as the stone he broke. Samuel was right. He was not the same man who had been arrested in 1862. That man was gone, buried somewhere between the Hulk and Pentonville, and the quarry floor. What was left was something harder, something that could survive. He did not know if that was better or worse. In the common room one night, Peter introduced him to 2 other men, William and George, both convicted under the same laws, both serving long sentences. William was quiet, a former school teacher. He spoke with a precision that suggested education and careful thought. He had been at Portland for 5 years. George was the opposite, loud, brash, quick to laugh. He had been a sailor before his arrest. The irony of ending up in a prison overlooking the sea was not lost on him. "I used to sail these waters," George said, gesturing toward the window where you could just see the dark line of the ocean. "Now I break rocks and stare at it like a painting." "Could be worse," Peter said. "Could be better. Could always be both." They talked late into the evening, about nothing important, ships, weather, food, the guards, anything but their sentences or their crimes. It was the first real conversation Thomas had had in over a year. He did not say much, just listened. Let the sound of their voices fill the empty spaces inside him. When the bell rang for lights out, Peter walked with him back to the cell block. "You should come sit with us more often," Peter said. "Why?" "Because you look like you need it." Peter stopped at the entrance to his own cell. "And because we all do." Thomas nodded. He did not trust his voice to say anything else. That night he lay on his plank bed and thought about Arthur and James and all the men he had loved or almost loved or never got the chance to love. He thought about the Hulk, the anchor cable room, the stolen minutes, the fear and the hope tangled up together. He thought about the letters Arthur had written and never sent, the promise of stars and quiet days and no more fear. Thomas did not know if he would survive long enough to see those things, did not know if Arthur was even alive to share them with. But for the first time in months, he let himself imagine it anyway. A small house somewhere far from London, far from the river and the hulks and the prisons. A place where no one knew their names. Arthur working in a garden. Thomas fixing the roof. Both of them growing old and grey and ordinary. It was a fantasy, a dream. It would probably never happen. But it was his, and no one could take it from him. The years at Portland passed in the rhythm of the quarry. Swing, strike, break, load. Seasons changed. Men came and went. Some were released. Some died. Some were transferred to other facilities. Thomas stayed, worked, survived. He became friends with Peter and William and George, in the quiet way men in prison became friends. They did not talk about the future. They did not make plans. They just existed together in the present, and that was enough. In his 7th year at Portland, Thomas was promoted to a better work detail. Instead of breaking stone in the quarry, he was assigned to the harbour crew. They loaded the stone onto ships bound for naval construction projects across England. It was easier work. Still hard, but you were not swinging a hammer all day. And you got to see the ships come and go, got to watch the ocean and imagine what it would be like to sail away. One morning, a supply ship docked. The crew unloaded goods for the prison. Food, tools, cloth, mail. Thomas was hauling crates when one of the sailors looked at him and froze. "Thomas?" Thomas looked up. The sailor was thin, weathered, much older than the last time Thomas had seen him. But the eyes were the same. It was James. Thomas dropped the crate. It hit the dock with a crash that made the guards turn their heads. "Careful!" one of them shouted. Thomas barely heard. He was staring at James. At the face, he had not seen in 8 years. The man who had been torn away from him in a courtroom and sent to a different hulk and vanished into the machinery of the Empire's prison system. James was alive. He looked different, thinner, harder, lines around his eyes that had not been there before. His hair was cut short. His skin was tanned dark from years at sea. But it was him. James's mouth opened like he wanted to say something. Then he glanced at the guards and closed it again. They stared at each other across 10 feet of dock. Between them, the gap of 8 years. 2 different lives. 2 different hells. A guard walked over to Thomas. "Get back to work." Thomas bent to pick up the crate. His hands were shaking. James turned away and continued unloading the ship with the rest of the crew. Thomas worked mechanically for the next hour, hauling crates, stacking them, not thinking. If he let himself think, he would break down right there on the dock. The supply ship stayed in port for 3 hours, long enough to unload and take on fresh water. The crew was allowed shore leave during the wait, meaning they could walk around the dock area under supervision, but not leave the naval grounds. Thomas was not allowed near them. Prisoners and free men did not mix. But James found a way. During the shift change, when the guards rotated and there were a few minutes of chaos, James walked past Thomas carrying a coil of rope. He dropped a piece of paper as he passed. Thomas stepped on it, waited, then bent down as if to tie his boot and palmed the paper. It was a scrap torn from a logbook. The writing was cramped and smudged, but legible. "I am here until sundown. Can you get to the storage shed near the water gate at 4? Thomas looked up. James was already gone, back with the rest of the crew. 4 o'clock was the end of the work shift. Prisoners were supposed to go directly back to the cell blocks for count, but the storage shed was on the way. If Thomas was fast, if he was careful, he could steal 5 minutes. It was stupid, reckless. If he was caught outside the work area without permission, he would lose privileges, maybe worse. But it was James. Thomas folded the paper into his pocket and went back to work. The rest of the shift crawled. Every minute felt like an hour. Thomas's mind was racing. What would he say? What could he say? 8 years had passed. They were different people now. Maybe James was not even the same man Thomas remembered. Maybe Thomas was not either. At 4 o'clock the bell rang. The prisoners lined up for the walk back to the cell block. Thomas was near the back of the line. As they passed the storage shed, he slowed, pretended to adjust his boot again. The guard at the front kept walking. The prisoners behind Thomas moved past him. Thomas slipped sideways and ducked into the shed. It was dark inside, smelled like tar and salt and old wood. James was standing near the back wall, half hidden in shadow. They looked at each other. "You are alive," James said. His voice was rougher than Thomas remembered, scraped raw by wind and salt air. "So are you." "I thought..." James stopped. Started again. "When they separated us, I thought I would never see you again." "You were not supposed to." James stepped closer, not touching, just close enough that Thomas could see his face properly. The years had not been kind. There were scars, a badly healed break in his nose, hands that were rope-burned and calloused. "What happened to you?" Thomas asked. "I was on the Warrior for 2 years. Then they transported me to Van Diemen's Land. I served 5 years in a labour camp there, logging, road building." James looked down at his hands. "I got my ticket of leave in 71. Worked as a deckhand on merchant ships after that. Been at sea ever since." "You are free?" "Conditionally. I cannot return to England, cannot leave the colonies without permission." James smiled bitterly. "But I am not in chains. So yes, free enough." Thomas felt something twist inside him. James was free, damaged and exiled, but free. And Thomas still had 2 years left on his sentence. "What about you?" James asked. Thomas told him. The defence, Pentonville, Portland, the work, the silence, the endless grinding years. He did not mention Arthur. Some things were too complicated to explain. When he finished, James was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and took Thomas's hand. The touch was shocking. Thomas had not been touched with tenderness in so long he had almost forgotten what it felt like. "I am sorry," James said quietly. "For what?" "For not being there. For not—" He stopped. His grip tightened. "I loved you. I still do. I never stopped." Thomas's throat closed. He wanted to say it back. Wanted to say he had loved James too, had thought about him every day, had carried the memory of him through the worst of it. But the words would not come, because somewhere in the years between then and now, Thomas had fallen in love with someone else. And even though Arthur was gone, lost to the prison system the same way James had been, Thomas could not pretend that love had not existed. "I loved you too," Thomas said finally. "I did, but—" "You do not anymore." It was not a question. Thomas shook his head. "I do, just not the same way." James let go of his hand. He did not look angry, just sad, tired. "There was someone else," he said. "Yes." "What happened to him?" "I do not know. We were separated. I have not seen him in 2 years." James nodded slowly. "What was his name?" "Arthur." "Do you love him?" "Yes." The word hung in the air between them. Simple, true, impossible. James smiled. It was a sad, broken thing, but it was real. "Then I hope you find him again." "James, I mean it." James reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I am sailing to Sydney in 2 days. If you get out, if you ever make it to Australia, find me. I work the merchant routes between Sydney and Melbourne. Someone at the docks will know where to find me." He pressed the paper into Thomas's hand. It had an address written on it. A contact in Sydney. "Why?" Thomas asked. "Because you deserve a life after this, and because I want to know you made it." Thomas looked at the paper, then at James, the man he had loved when he was young and stupid and thought love could protect you from the world. "Thank you," he said. James pulled him into a brief, tight hug, then let go and stepped back. "Go," he said, "before they notice you are gone." Thomas went. He slipped out of the shed and caught up with the tail end of the prisoner line just before they entered the cell block. No one had noticed his absence, or if they had, they did not report it. That night, Thomas lay on his plank bed and stared at the address James had given him. Sydney, Australia, a world away. He did not know if he would ever get there, did not know if he would survive the next 2 years, did not know if Arthur was alive to search for, but he folded the paper carefully and hid it in the seam of his mattress, just in case. The encounter with James changed something in Thomas. Not all at once. Just a slow shift in the way he thought about time. Before, the days had been something to survive, to endure. You put your head down and worked and did not think about the future, because the future was just more of the same. But now, the future had a shape, a possibility. 2 more years and his sentence would end. He would be released with a ticket of leave, same as James. He could work, earn money, maybe even leave England if he saved enough. And if Arthur was alive, if he had been released too, Thomas could look for him. It was a fragile hope, built on a foundation of maybes and ifs, but it was something. Thomas started counting days again, not in the despairing way he had on the Hulk, but in the way of someone who believed there might be an ending. 730 days. He worked harder, kept his record clean, volunteered for extra shifts when they were available. Anything to make the time pass faster. Peter noticed. "You are different," Peter said one evening in the common room. "How?" "Less like a ghost, more like a man." Thomas did not know how to explain it, so he just nodded. Peter did not push. He just sat beside Thomas and they played cards in silence, while George told an elaborate story about a bar fight in Portsmouth that probably never happened. The rhythm of prison life continued. Work, meals, sleep, The occasional fight, the rare death. In Thomas's 8th year at Portland, a riot broke out in the quarry. It started over rations. Someone accused someone else of stealing and escalated into a full brawl. 30 men throwing punches and rocks. Guards wading in with clubs. Thomas was not involved. He was loading a cart on the far side of the quarry when it started. But when the guards sorted everyone out afterward, they did not care who had participated and who had not. Everyone in the area lost privileges for a month. No common room, no letters, reduced rations. It was a setback, a reminder that even when you followed the rules, the system could punish you arbitrarily. But Thomas endured it. He was good at enduring by now. 540 days left. In the 9th year, William died. He collapsed in the quarry one afternoon. Heart failure, the surgeon said later. He was 46 years old. He had served 7 years of a 10-year sentence. They buried him in the prison cemetery with no marker, just a wooden cross and a number. George took it hard. He and William had been close. Not lovers, at least not openly, but something like it. He was going to open a bookshop, George said the night after the burial. When he got out, somewhere quiet, he talked about it all the time. Peter poured George a cup of water from the communal bucket. He would have been good at that. He would have been great at it. George wiped his eyes roughly. And now no one will ever know. Thomas thought about Arthur's letter, the one about stars and quiet days and growing old together. He wondered if Arthur had dreams like William's, small, ordinary dreams that would never happen. He wondered if Arthur was already dead too. The thought made him feel sick, but he could not shake it. 365 days left. The final year of Thomas's sentence was the longest and the shortest. Long because he was counting every single day. Short because he knew it would end. He worked. He kept his head down. He stayed out of trouble. And he thought about what came next. When you were released from prison with a ticket of leave, you were not truly free. You had to report to the police regularly. You could not leave the district without permission. You were barred from certain types of employment. And if you had been convicted of sodomy, you were marked for life. The conviction followed you. Employers could refuse to hire you. Landlords could refuse to rent to you. You were legally labelled a dangerous deviant. Thomas knew all this, but he also knew that England was a big place, and the colonies were bigger. If he could get to Australia, he could disappear, start over under a new name, find James. Maybe even find Arthur if Arthur had been transported too. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. 180 days left. In the final months, Thomas started saving. Not money. Prisoners were not paid, but favours. Small things. He helped other men with their work quotas, fixed things for the guards when they asked, made himself useful in quiet ways that people remembered. When you were released, you were given a small sum of money. £5. Enough for a week of food and lodging if you were careful, but not enough to get far. Thomas needed more than that. So he traded favours for promises. Men who were getting out before him, men who had connections on the outside. Peter helped. He knew people. He made introductions. He vouched for Thomas in ways that mattered. "Why are you doing this?" Thomas asked him one night. "Because someone did it for me once," Peter said, "and because you deserve a chance." 90 days left. Thomas started having nightmares, not about prison, about freedom, about walking out the gates and not knowing what to do, where to go, who to be. He had been Thomas White, convict, for 10 years. He did not know how to be anything else anymore. George told him it was normal. Everyone gets like this near the end. You are afraid it is a trick, that they will add more time, that you will die the day before release. "Did you feel like this?" George laughed. "I am still here, am I not? Ask me when I get out." 30 days left. Thomas started seeing Arthur everywhere, in the face of a guard, in the shape of a prisoner across the yard, in dreams that felt more real than waking. He did not know if it was hope or madness, maybe both. Peter told him about a boarding house in London that took men with records. It was not much. Shared rooms, thin walls, but it was cheap, and the landlord did not ask questions. "Go there first," Peter said. "Get your bearings, then figure out your next move." Thomas memorized the address. 7 days left. The final week was surreal. Thomas went through the motions of prison life knowing they were the last times. Last shift in the quarry. Last meal in the common room. Last night in the cell. On the final evening, Peter and George sat with him. "You are really leaving," George said. He sounded almost disbelieving. "Looks like it." "Bastard, we had a bet on whether you would make it." "Who won?" Peter grinned. "I did. I always knew you were too stubborn to die." They talked late into the night, about nothing important. Just 3 men killing time because it was the last time they would ever do it together. When the bell rang for lights out, they shook hands. Brief, firm. "Find him," Peter said quietly. "Find Arthur. Live the life you were supposed to have." Thomas nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. The next morning, Thomas White walked out of Portland prison a free man. He was 33 years old. He had spent 10 years in chains, 4 on a rotting hulk, 2 in silence, 4 breaking stone. He had £5 in his pocket, the clothes on his back, an address in Sydney, a memory of a man named Arthur, and for the first time in a decade, he could walk in any direction he chose. He stood on the hill outside the prison and looked down at the ocean. The same ocean he had stared at for 4 years while breaking rocks. It looked different from this side of the wall. Thomas walked down the hill toward the harbour. He did not look back. The boarding house Peter had told him about was in Whitechapel. It took Thomas 3 days to walk there from Portland. He could have taken a coach, but he wanted to save the money. And he wanted to feel the ground under his feet. Wanted to remember what it was like to walk without chains. London was bigger than he remembered. Louder, more crowded. The streets were filthy and chaotic and overwhelming. Thomas loved it. The noise, the people, the sheer crushing normalcy of it all. No one looked at him twice. No one knew he was a convict. He was just another man in a crowd of thousands. The boarding house was exactly as Peter described. A narrow building squeezed between a gin house and a tailor shop. The sign above the door said rooms in peeling paint. Inside it smelled like boiled cabbage and damp wool. The landlord was a woman named Mrs. Kettering. She was old, heavy, missing most of her teeth. She looked Thomas up and down. "You got money?" £5. "That will get you 2 months if you share a room. 1 month if you want private." "Shared is fine." She nodded and led him upstairs. The room was tiny. 2 beds, a table, a cracked window that looked out over an alley. There was already someone in the other bed. A man about Thomas's age with red hair and a face full of freckles. He looked up when Thomas entered. "New?" "Yes." "I am Charlie." He held out a hand. Thomas shook it. "Thomas." Charlie grinned. "Welcome to the palace." The room was not a palace, but it was clean enough, and it was his. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall and tried to remember what normal people did with their time. Charlie was a printer's assistant. He worked long hours for low pay and spent his evenings in the gin house downstairs. He was friendly in an uncomplicated way that Thomas found both comforting and exhausting. "You looking for work?" Charlie asked on the second night. "Yes." "Can you read?" "No." Charlie frowned. "That makes it harder. Most jobs want reading now." He thought for a moment. "You any good with your hands?" Thomas looked down at his scarred, calloused hands. 10 years of hard labour had made them good for exactly one thing. "I can lift things," he said. "Dockyards, then. They are always hiring. Pay is shit, but it is steady." The next morning, Thomas went to the docks. He stood in line with 50 other men waiting for the foreman to pick work crews. The foreman walked down the line, pointing at men. You, not you." He passed Thomas without looking. Thomas tried again the next day, and the day after. On the 4th day, the foreman pointed at him. You. Ever worked a dock before? Yes. Good. You are on the loading crew. The work was exactly what Thomas expected. Hauling crates, loading ships, unloading cargo, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The pay was 3 shillings a day if you were fast, less if you were slow. Thomas was fast. 10 years of prison labour had taught him how to work through pain and exhaustion, how to keep moving when your body screamed to stop. The other dock workers did not talk much. They worked. They took their pay at the end of the week. They went home, or to the pub, or wherever men with families and lives outside the docks went. Thomas went back to the boarding house, ate whatever Mrs. Kettering had boiled that day, sat on his bed and stared at the wall. Charlie tried to get him to come to the gin house a few times. "You're too serious," Charlie said. "You need to live a little." Thomas did not know how to explain that he had forgotten how to live, that 10 years of survival had scraped out whatever part of him knew how to be anything other than careful. So he just said he was tired. Charlie shrugged and went drinking without him. Thomas lay in bed and thought about Arthur, wondered where he was, if he had been released yet, if he was alive. There was no way to find out, no records he could access, no one he could ask without revealing why he wanted to know. Men convicted of sodomy did not have friends who kept track of them. They had ghosts. Thomas was haunted by ghosts. After a month of dock work, Thomas had saved £2. He kept it hidden in his boot. Mrs. Kettering was honest, but the other tenants in the building were not. He started asking questions, carefully, indirectly. At the docks, during the brief lunch break, he would listen to the other men talk. Sometimes they mentioned prisons, transfers, men they had known who had been released or died or disappeared into the system. Thomas listened for any mention of Pentonville, of Arthur Finch, of men convicted under morality laws. He heard nothing. In the gin house one evening, Charlie had finally convinced him to come. Thomas sat in the corner and watched the crowd. Working men, sailors on leave, a few women who worked the streets nearby, and in the back corner, 3 men sitting very close together, talking quietly. One of them laughed and touched another's arm in a way that was too familiar, too intimate. Thomas recognized that touch, the careful way you reached for someone when you were not allowed to. He did not approach them. You did not approach unless you were invited, but he noted where they sat, what time they arrived, how long they stayed. The next week he came back, same corner, same time. The 3 men were there again. One of them, dark hair, thin build, quick smile, glanced over and met Thomas's eyes. The man looked away. But a few minutes later he stood and walked past Thomas on his way to the bar. As he passed, he said quietly, "Upstairs, 3rd door, 10 minutes." Then he was gone. Thomas waited, counted the minutes, then stood and walked upstairs like he was looking for the privy. The 3rd door was ajar. Thomas pushed it open. The dark-haired man was inside. So were the other 2, and 4 more men Thomas had not noticed downstairs. 7 men in a small room above a gin house, all of them looking at Thomas with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity. "Close the door," the dark-haired man said. Thomas closed it. "You have been watching us," the man said. Not accusatory, just stating fact. "I was not trying to—" "Relax, we have been watching you too." The man held out a hand. "I am Daniel." Thomas shook it. "Thomas. Are you looking for company, Thomas, or trouble?" "Neither. I am looking for someone." That got their attention. One of the other men, older, grey at the temples, stepped forward. "Who?" "A man named Arthur Finch. He was at Pentonville, convicted of gross indecency in 1862. I have not seen him in 2 years." The room went quiet. The men exchanged glances. "Why are you looking for him?" Daniel asked carefully. Thomas could lie. Make up a story. Say Arthur owed him money, or they were old friends, or any number of things that would sound safer. But he was tired of lying. tired of hiding. "Because I love him," Thomas said, "and I need to know if he is alive." Another silence. Then the older man nodded slowly. "I know that name," he said. "Arthur Finch. He was released from Pentonville 8 months ago. I heard he went north, Manchester maybe, or Liverpool, somewhere he could disappear." Thomas felt something in his chest crack open. Arthur was alive, released, free. "Are you sure?" Thomas asked. "Sure enough. The man who told me knew him from inside." "Do you know where exactly? An address?" The man shook his head. "Just that he went north. Beyond that." He shrugged. It was not much. But it was more than Thomas had 5 minutes ago. "Thank you," Thomas said. Daniel stepped closer. "You were inside too." It was not a question. Something about Thomas, the way he stood, the way he spoke, marked him as clearly as a brand. 10 years, Thomas said. "Just released 2 months ago." Daniel nodded. "Then you should know. We meet here every Thursday, upstairs, around 9. It is not much, just men like us, talking, existing without pretending." He paused. "You are welcome to come back." Thomas looked around the room. 7 men, 7 faces marked by the same careful wariness he saw in the mirror every morning. Men like us. He had not heard those words spoken aloud since Portland, since Peter and William and George. "I will think about it," Thomas said. He went back the next Thursday. The gatherings above the gin house became a strange kind of anchor. Not quite community, not quite friendship, but something. The men who came were all different. Some were young, some old. Some had been arrested and released. Some had never been caught, but lived in constant fear of it. Some were wealthy enough to hide behind respectability. Most were not. They did not use last names. They did not talk about their work or where they lived. The room above the gin house was a space outside normal life. What happened there stayed there. Mostly they just talked, complained about the weather, told jokes, argued about politics or theatre or anything that was not the daily grinding fear of being who they were. Sometimes they shared information. Who had been arrested recently? Which areas of the city were being watched by police? Which pubs were safe and which were not? Daniel seemed to be the one who organised it, though he never said as much. He just knew everyone, kept track, made sure the room stayed rented and the landlord stayed paid off. One evening, Thomas asked him how long the gatherings had been happening. 5 years, Daniel said. Started smaller. Just 3 of us. Grew from there. You were never caught? Not yet. Daniel smiled grimly. We are careful. No one stays longer than 2 hours. No one arrives or leaves in groups. And we pay the landlord enough to keep his mouth shut. What happens if someone talks? Then we disappear and start again somewhere else. Daniel looked at Thomas. You learn to be flexible when you live like we do. Thomas understood that better than most. He kept working the docks, kept saving money. £3 now, then 4. His plan was forming slowly. Save enough for passage to Australia. Go to Sydney. Find James. James would know the merchant networks, would know how to track someone down. And if Arthur had been transported instead of released, he might be in Australia too. It was a long shot. But Thomas had built his life on long shots for 10 years. In his 4th month out of prison, Thomas saw Edward Gill. It was on the docks. Gill was with a group of men inspecting cargo for the Admiralty. He looked the same, maybe a little greyer, a little thicker around the middle. Thomas froze. Every muscle in his body locked up. His vision narrowed. For a moment, he was back in the storage room on the Defence. Back in the darkness, with Gill's hands on him and nowhere to run. Then Gill looked up, and their eyes met. Gill's expression did not change. He looked at Thomas like he was looking at a stranger. No recognition, no acknowledgement. Then he turned back to his inspection and walked away. Thomas stood there shaking. The foreman yelled at him to get back to work. Thomas could not move, could not breathe. One of the other dock workers, a man named Bill, who Thomas had worked beside for weeks, grabbed his arm. "You all right?" Thomas nodded. It was a lie. "You look like you have seen a ghost." Something like that. Bill did not push, just steered Thomas back to work and covered for him when his hands shook too badly to hold the cargo hooks. That night, Thomas did not go back to the boarding house. He walked, miles and miles through the East End until his legs ached and the sky started to lighten. He ended up by the river. The Thames was black and slow, and it smelled like rot, like the hulks. Thomas stood on the embankment and stared at the water and thought about drowning. Not seriously, just the way you thought about escape when the world pressed too hard. He thought about Jill, about all the men like Jill, guards and landlords and employers and priests who used men like Thomas and then walked away without a backward glance. He thought about Arthur, about whether Arthur had men like Gil in his past too, whether he had survived them or been broken by them. Thomas did not drown himself. He went back to the boarding house and slept for 12 hours and woke up feeling scraped hollow. But he kept going, because that was what you did. The money kept accumulating. £5, 6, 7. Passage to Australia cost £12 if you went steerage. That was his goal. £12 and he could leave. He asked around the docks about ships heading to Sydney. The merchant routes, the timing. A ship called the Dunbar left London for Sydney every 3 months. The next sailing was in January. That gave Thomas 4 more months to save. He worked double shifts when he could, skipped meals, walked instead of taking the omnibus. Charlie noticed. "You are killing yourself," Charlie said one night. "What are you saving for?" "Passage out." "Out where?" "Australia." Charlie whistled low. "That is a long way to run." "I am not running." "Everyone who goes to Australia is running from something." Thomas did not argue. Charlie was right. In October, Thomas went back to the gin house on a Thursday. Daniel was there, so were a dozen other men, more than usual. "Word is spreading," Daniel said quietly. "We might need to move soon. Too many people means too much risk." But that night they stayed, and a new man arrived, young, maybe 22, terrified. His name was Robin. He had been arrested 3 weeks ago, caught with another man in a public lavatory. The charges were dropped, not enough evidence, but he had lost his job. His family had disowned him. He had nowhere to go. Daniel listened to his story. Then he turned to the room. "Anyone have work, or a place he can stay?" 3 men offered leads on jobs. 1 offered a spare room. By the end of the night, Robin had a plan. Not much of one, but more than he had walked in with. Thomas watched it happen and felt something shift inside him. This was what survival looked like when you were not alone. People helping people because they understood, because they had been there. He thought about Peter doing the same for him at Portland. Thought about Arthur stealing bread for him on the Hulk. Thought about James giving him an address in Sydney, even though Thomas had loved someone else. Small mercies. They added up. When the gathering ended, Thomas pulled Daniel aside. "I am leaving in January," Thomas said, "going to Australia. But before I go, I want to help, however I can." Daniel studied him. "You do not owe us anything." "I know, but I want to." Daniel nodded slowly. "All right. We always need money. Rent, bribes, help for men like Robin who have nothing." Thomas took out £2 from his savings and handed them over. It left him with £5, not enough for passage anymore. He would have to work longer, save more, but it felt right. Daniel took the money and shook Thomas's hand. "Thank you." Thomas went back to saving. This time it felt different. He was not just surviving, he was building towards something. £9, 10, 11. December came, cold and grey. London smelled like coal smoke and sewage. The Dunbar was scheduled to sail January 15th. Thomas bought his ticket on December 20th, steerage class, £12 exactly. He had 2 weeks left in London. Charlie was sad to see him go. "You are the best roommate I have had," Charlie said. "You do not snore. You do not steal. You do not bring women back who rob me." "That happened to you?" "Twice." Thomas almost smiled. "I will miss you too." "Write when you get there?" "I cannot write." "Then find someone who can. Let me know you made it." Thomas promised he would try. On his last Thursday in London, Thomas went to the gin house. Daniel was there, so were most of the regulars, and Robin, who had found work and looked less terrified than he had 2 months ago. Thomas told them he was leaving. "Good luck," Daniel said. "And if you find what you are looking for, remember us." "I will." One of the older men, the one who had first told Thomas about Arthur going north, pulled him aside. "I heard something," the man said quietly. "About your Arthur." Thomas's heart stopped. "What?" "A friend of a friend saw a man matching his description in Liverpool, working the docks, going by a different name, but the description fits. Dark hair, thin, scar on his left hand from a prison work accident." Arthur had a scar on his left hand, from picking oakum at Pentonville. "When?" Thomas asked. 3 weeks ago. Liverpool. That was north. That matched what the man had said before. "Are you sure?" "Sure enough to tell you." Thomas felt the world tilt. Arthur was in Liverpool. Maybe. Possibly. He had a ticket to Sydney in 3 weeks. He could go to Liverpool instead. Look for Arthur. Find him if he was really there. But if Arthur was not there, Thomas would have wasted his ticket, his money, his chance to start over. "Thank you," Thomas said. The man nodded and walked away. Thomas stood there trying to decide. Sydney meant James. A job, a life in a place no one knew him. Liverpool meant Arthur, maybe. If he was there, if he was the right man, if Thomas could find him in a city of hundreds of thousands. It was not a fair choice, but life had stopped being fair a long time ago. Thomas went back to the boarding house and lay awake all night thinking. By morning he had decided. He went to the shipping office and asked if he could exchange his ticket on the Dunbar for a different sailing. Later, maybe March or April. The clerk was annoyed but agreed. For a fee. Thomas paid it. Now he had £8 left and no ticket. But he had time. He bought a coach ticket to Liverpool. It cost 2 shillings. The coach left the next morning. Thomas packed his few belongings into a cloth sack, said goodbye to Charlie and Mrs. Kettering. "You will be back," Mrs. Kettering said. "They always come back." Thomas did not think so, but he did not argue. The coach to Liverpool took 2 days. It was crowded and cold, and the roads were terrible. Thomas sat in the back and stared out the window at the countryside passing by. England looked different when you were not in chains. Greener, wider, full of possibility. Or maybe Thomas was different. Maybe 10 years of prison had scraped out the part of him that saw the world as small. Liverpool was bigger than London, busier. The docks stretched for miles. Ships from every corner of the empire crowded the harbour. Thomas stood on the waterfront and felt completely lost. Finding one man in this city was impossible. He knew that. But he had come this far. He started at the docks, showed up every morning at the hiring lines, watched the men, listened to names being called. No Arthur, no one who looked like him. He asked around, carefully. "I am looking for a friend. Dark hair, thin, scar on his left hand. Might be going by a different name." Most people shrugged. A few looked at him suspiciously. One foreman told him to stop bothering the workers. Thomas kept looking. He found a boarding house near the docks, cheaper than Mrs. Kettering's, dirtier too, but it was a place to sleep. Days turned into weeks. Thomas worked when he could, saved what little he earned, looked for Arthur in every face he passed. He started to think he had made a mistake, that the man in Liverpool was not Arthur, that Arthur was in Sydney, or dead, or anywhere but here. Then one evening Thomas was walking past a pub near the Prince's Dock and he saw him. Arthur was standing outside, talking to another dock worker. He looked older, thinner. His hair was longer, but it was him. Thomas stopped breathing. Arthur finished his conversation and turned to go inside the pub. Thomas followed. The pub was dark and crowded. Thomas pushed through bodies, keeping Arthur in sight. Arthur walked to the bar, ordered a drink, leaned against the wood like a man who had done this 1,000 times. Thomas stood 3 feet away and did not know what to say. Arthur turned. Their eyes met. For a moment there was nothing, no recognition. Arthur's gaze passed over Thomas like he was looking at a stranger. Then Arthur's face changed, colour drained, his mouth opened. Thomas? The name came out like a prayer, like something he had not dared say aloud in years. It is me, Thomas said. Arthur put his drink down. His hand was shaking. You are alive. So are you. They stared at each other across 3 feet of sawdust floor. Between them, 2 years, 100 miles, the entire weight of the system that had tried to erase them both. Arthur took a step forward, then stopped, like he did not know if he was allowed. Thomas closed the distance. He reached out and took Arthur's hand, the one with the scar. Arthur gripped back so hard it hurt. I thought. Arthur's voice broke. He tried again. When they transferred you to Portland, I thought I would never see you again. I looked for you. I have been looking for months. I have been here, working, hiding. Arthur's eyes were wet. I did not think anyone would look. I looked. Around them the pub noise continued, men drinking, laughing, arguing, oblivious to the reunion happening in their midst. Thomas did not care. He was looking at Arthur, really looking, the lines around his eyes, the grey starting at his temples, the way he still stood with one shoulder slightly higher than the other from years of hunching in low-ceilinged cells. Can we go somewhere? Thomas asked. Somewhere we can talk? Arthur nodded. He drained his drink in one swallow. Then he led Thomas out of the pub. They walked in silence through the Liverpool streets. Arthur did not explain where they were going. Thomas did not ask. He just followed. After 10 minutes, they reached a boarding house, nicer than the one Thomas was staying in. Arthur led him upstairs to a small room on the 3rd floor. It was sparse. A bed, a table, a chair, a window overlooking the docks. Arthur closed the door behind them. They stood in the middle of the room and looked at each other. I dreamed this, Arthur said quietly, seeing you again. I dreamed it so many times I stopped believing it could be real. It is real. I know, Arthur reached out and touched Thomas's face, gentle, tentative, like he was afraid Thomas might disappear. You are thinner, older. So are you. Prison will do that. They both smiled. It was not funny, but after everything else, the absurdity of understatement was all they had. Tell me what happened, Arthur said. After Portland, after they released you. Thomas told him. London, the docks, the gatherings, James, the plan to go to Australia, the decision to come to Liverpool instead. When he finished, Arthur was quiet for a long time. You gave up Australia to look for me, Arthur said finally. Yes. That was stupid. Probably. Why would you do that? Thomas looked at him, at the man he had loved in the dark on a rotting ship, the man who had slept on the floor beside him when he was dying, the man who had written letters about stars and quiet days and futures that seemed impossible. Because I love you, Thomas said. I never stopped. Arthur closed his eyes. A tear slid down his cheek. Then another. Thomas pulled him close. Arthur collapsed against him. They held each other in the middle of that small room, and for the first time in 10 years, Thomas felt like he could breathe. They stayed like that for a long time, not speaking, just holding on. Eventually, Arthur pulled back. He wiped his face roughly. I am sorry, You do not have to apologize. I do, for not being stronger, for not finding you first, for... Thomas kissed him, soft and careful. Arthur kissed him back. When they broke apart, Arthur was smiling. It was a broken, tentative thing, but it was real. I kept the letter, Arthur said, the one I wrote you on the hulk, about the stars and the quiet place. You still have it? I kept it all this time. It is the only thing I have from before. Arthur walked to the table and opened a drawer. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft from years of handling. He handed it to Thomas. Thomas unfolded it. The writing was faded, but still legible. He read it again, the words he had traced in the dark years ago. I want to live somewhere you can see the stars, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one knows our names or what we were convicted of. I want to grow old with you. I want boring days and warm beds and no more fear. Do you still want that? Thomas asked. More than anything. Then let us find it. Arthur looked at him. How? We have nothing. No money, no prospects. We are both marked men. We cannot stay in England without looking over our shoulders forever. Australia, Thomas said. We go to Australia. Start over. New names. New lives. That costs money. I have £8. You must have saved something. Arthur nodded slowly. I have 6. That is 14 total. Enough for one passage, not 2. Thomas thought for a moment. Then he remembered James, the address in Sydney, the promise to find him if Thomas ever made it. I know someone in Sydney, Thomas said. A merchant sailor. He owes me a favour. If we can get to Sydney, he can help us find work, a place to live. You trust him? Yes. Arthur looked at the letter in Thomas's hands, then back at Thomas. When can we leave? There is a ship called the Dunbar. She sails for Sydney in March. I can get us both on her if we pool our money. Steerage. Yes, Arthur nodded. Then we save. We work. We stay quiet. And in March, we disappear. It became their plan, their secret, their future. Thomas moved out of his boarding house and into Arthur's room. They told the landlord they were brothers. The landlord did not care as long as the rent was paid. They both found work at the docks, different crews, so no one noticed them arriving and leaving together. They worked every shift they could, saved every penny. At night, they lay in the narrow bed and talked about the hulk, about Pentonville, about Portland, about all the things they had survived. Arthur told Thomas about the months after they were separated, the silence, the isolation, the slow erosion of hope. I started counting days, Arthur said, not to my release, to my death. I was sure I would die before the sentence ended, but you did not. No. And some days I do not know if that was luck or punishment. Thomas understood. He felt the same way. They also talked about the future, what Sydney might be like, what kind of work they could find, where they would live. I want a garden, Arthur said one night. Somewhere I can grow things, something alive. I want a dog, Thomas said. Arthur laughed. A dog? I have never had one. I want to see what it is like. To have a dog. To have something that is just mine, that I do not have to hide. Arthur kissed his forehead. We will get you a dog. The weeks passed. January, February. The money accumulated. £18, 19, 20. More than enough for 2 passages, enough for a small cushion when they arrived. Thomas bought their tickets in late February. 2 passages on the Dunbar. Sailing March 7th. Steerage class. Registered under false names. Arthur became Arthur Grant. Thomas became Thomas Bell. They memorized the names, practiced signing them, became the men they would pretend to be. On their last night in Liverpool, they lay in bed and talked about what they were leaving behind. Do you have any family? Arthur asked. My mother is still alive, in Kent. I have not seen her in 12 years. Do you want to? Thomas thought about it, then shook his head. She did not come to my trial, did not write. I think she is happier pretending I died. I am sorry. It is all right. I have you. Arthur pulled him closer. What about James? The man from the Hulk? You said you loved him. I did, but not the way I love you. What is the difference? Thomas thought about how to explain it. James was survival. You are life. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. It is true. I know. That is why it is romantic. They made love that night, slow and careful and full of tenderness. It was different from the stolen moments on the Hulk, different from the desperate touches in the anchor cable room. This was not survival. This was choice. Afterward, they lay tangled together and listened to the sounds of Liverpool outside. The docks, the ships, the endless movement of a city that never slept. Are you afraid? Arthur asked. Of what? Australia, the voyage, starting over. Thomas thought about it honestly. Yes, but I am more afraid of staying. Me too. The Dunbar was a 3-masted sailing ship. She had made the journey to Australia dozens of times. She was considered safe, reliable. Thomas and Arthur boarded on March 7th with 120 other passengers. Most were emigrants, families looking for new lives, young men seeking fortune, a few convicts being transported under guard. No one looked at Thomas and Arthur twice. Just 2 more working men heading for the colonies. Steerage was below deck, a large open space with rows of bunks stacked 3 high. Men on one side, women and families on the other. A curtain divided them. Thomas and Arthur were assigned bunks near the stern. They were not next to each other. The bunks were assigned randomly, but they were close enough. The voyage would take 4 months, maybe longer if the weather was bad. Thomas had lived through worse. The first week was the hardest. Seasickness struck half the passengers. The smell below deck was unbearable. People vomited. Children cried. The ship pitched and rolled and groaned. Thomas stayed on deck as much as possible, breathing fresh air, watching the horizon. Arthur joined him when he could. They stood at the rail and did not speak, just existed in proximity. 2 men among many, unremarkable, safe. By the second week, most people had adjusted. A routine emerged, meals at set times, exercise on deck, evening gatherings where people sang or told stories. Thomas and Arthur were careful not to spend too much time together. They talked to other passengers, made small talk, acted like acquaintances who happened to be travelling the same route. At night, when the lanterns were dimmed and most people were asleep, Arthur would sometimes reach across the gap between bunks and touch Thomas's hand. Brief, hidden by darkness. It was enough. One night, about 6 weeks into the voyage, Thomas woke to the sound of shouting. He sat up. The ship was pitching worse than usual. Water was sloshing across the floor. A storm had hit. Massive. The worst they had faced so far. Passengers were told to stay below and hold on. The crew worked above deck, securing rigging and sails. The ship heaved and bucked like a living thing, trying to throw them all into the sea. Thomas braced himself in his bunk and held on. Across the way, Arthur was doing the same. Their eyes met in the dim light. Arthur mouthed something. Thomas could not make it out over the noise. The storm lasted 12 hours. By the time it passed, 3 crew members had been washed overboard. 2 passengers had broken bones. The ship had lost a mast, but they were still afloat. The captain announced they would make an unscheduled stop at Cape Town to repair. The voyage would be delayed by 3 weeks. Thomas did not care. They were alive. That was what mattered. Cape Town was a brief respite. They docked for repairs. Passengers were allowed on shore for a few hours. Thomas and Arthur walked through the town together. It was the first time they had been on solid ground in 6 weeks. They bought food from a market stall, sat on a low wall overlooking the harbour, ate in silence. "This is nice," Arthur said. "What is?" "This. Being together. Not hiding." Thomas looked around. No one was paying attention to them, Just two men eating bread and cheese in the sun. We're still hiding, Thomas said quietly. I know, but it feels different here. Arthur smiled. Maybe in Sydney it will feel even more different. Maybe. They finished their meal and walked back to the ship. The rest of the voyage was uneventful, long, boring, exactly what a sea voyage was supposed to be. Thomas spent the time thinking about what came next. Finding James, getting work, building a life. He tried not to think about the things that could go wrong, the ways they could still be discovered. The fact that even in Australia, sodomy was a crime, but Australia was bigger than England, emptier, easier to disappear into. It would have to be enough. 4 months after leaving Liverpool, the Dunbar sailed into Sydney Harbour. Thomas stood at the rail with Arthur and watched the city appear through the morning mist. It was bigger than he expected, sprawling, chaotic, beautiful in a rough, unfinished way. There it is, Arthur said quietly. There it is. They docked in the late afternoon. Passengers disembarked slowly. Immigration officials checked papers, asked questions, marked names in ledgers. Arthur Grant and Thomas Bell passed inspection without issue. They walked down the gangplank into Sydney. Free men. On the other side of the world. Starting over. Thomas had the address James had given him years ago. A boarding house near Circular Quay. They found it easily. The landlord was a woman named Mrs. Chen. She was Chinese, middle-aged, spoke English with a heavy accent. You need room? She asked. Yes, for 2. Brothers? Arthur and Thomas exchanged a glance, then nodded. £2 a month. Share room. No trouble. They paid. Mrs. Chen showed them upstairs to a small room with 2 narrow beds and a window overlooking the harbour. It was perfect. That night, they lay in their separate beds. The walls were thin, and Mrs. Chen had other tenants, and whispered across the gap. We made it, Arthur said. We made it. What now? Now we live. The next morning, Thomas went looking for James. He asked at the docks, showed the address, asked if anyone knew a merchant sailor named James Dobson. The third person he asked nodded. Dobson, sure, he works the Melbourne run. Should be back in port next week. Thomas thanked him and walked back to the boarding house. Arthur had found work already. A printer needed someone to help with deliveries. The pay was not much, but it was a start. Thomas found work hauling cargo. Same as London, same as Liverpool. But different because here he was, Thomas Bell, a man with no record, no past, no one asked questions, no one cared. The week passed. Then James's ship docked. Thomas went to the harbour and waited. He saw James walking down the gangplank with the rest of the crew. James! Thomas called. James turned. His face went through several expressions. Confusion, recognition, shock, then joy. He walked over quickly. Thomas, my God, you made it. I made it. James pulled him into a brief hug. I did not think I would ever see you again. I almost did not come, but things changed. Arthur? Thomas nodded. He is here. We are here together. James smiled. It was warm, genuine. I am glad, truly. They talked for an hour. James introduced Thomas to other sailors, men who knew the merchant routes, who could recommend work, who knew which employers asked too many questions and which did not. By the end of the conversation, Thomas had 3 job leads, all of them better than hauling cargo. Thank you, Thomas said. You would have done the same, James said. Then he paused. Actually, I need to tell you something. What? There is a man here, in Sydney. His name is Henry. We have been... James trailed off, then started again. We are together, living together, as much as we can. Thomas felt a surge of happiness for him. That is good, James. I am happy for you. I wanted you to know. In case... James stopped. I do not know, in case it mattered. It matters, Thomas said, but not the way you think. It matters because you deserve to be happy. James looked relieved. You too. They parted as friends, not lovers, not the men they had been on the hulk, but something better. Think about Thomas and Arthur in their garden under the southern stars. Two old men who had lived through hell and come out the other side still holding hands. The world tried to destroy them. They survived anyway, and in surviving, they won. May your dreams be free of chains and silence and fear. May you wake tomorrow in a world where love is not a crime and survival is not the highest aspiration we can have. May you remember the men who came before, who lived in the shadows so we could walk in the light. Their names were lost, but their love remains, written in the margins of history, waiting for someone to notice, to remember, to say their names aloud and refuse to let them be forgotten. Good night, and sleep well.